Los Zetas had broken off from the Gulf Cartel. The Zetas did not have the advantage that Sinaloa or the Gulf Cartel had. So what they did is they used violence instead to conquer. They were so dangerous. There were shootings going on, decapitations, city by city, taking over. The brother of Miguel and Omar Treviño, who were the leaders of Zetas, was laundering money through quarter horse racing in Texas. They didn't try to hide it either, which was really wild. I mean, they were naming the horses like Break Out the Bullets, 44s. Big Daddy Cartel was another. So you could really see inside their operation and how it worked and how they really used terror and violence as their calling card.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to Underworlds. I'm Mark Shaw. Today, I'm speaking to Melissa Del Bosque, who's written a really good book. It's published in 2017 called Bloodlines, How the FBI Took on Mexico's Most Violent Drugs Cartel. And Melissa wrote the book obviously a while ago and has been doing interesting things. And welcome, Melissa. I wonder if we can start by just telling us what you're doing now. Are you still in the same kind of business? Are you still following issues on the border?
Yeah. Thank you for having me. Yes, I co-founded a publication called the Border Chronicle. So we cover the whole region, the U.S.-Mexico border, and I have been covering the U.S.-Mexico border since 1998. So it's been a long time, and still at it, and now based in Arizona.
I must say, Melissa, the book has a real sense of place. If you're listening and you read it, you'll see what I mean, because it moves from towns on either side of the border, and it's got the sense of space and place and geography, which really carry the story along.
Yeah.
Melissa, the events in the book are 2010 to 2012. You published it in 2017. The book covers this period of the Zetas, their enormous violence, their rise to prominence at the time. Just sort of outline that very briefly, and then how are things different now from the period you covered in the book to what you sense or what's happening in the border in relation to drugs, the cartels, etc. at the moment?
Yeah, sure. So like I said, I started reporting on the U.S.-Mexico border in the late 90s. And in 2010 is really when the drug war violence really started to take off in Mexico. And I write about that in the book. And it was important for me to put that context and the history in the book because at the time it was so confusing and so hard to really articulate what was happening. And what was happening was Los Zetas, who are the cartel that I write about in the book, had broken off from the Gulf Cartel, which was a major cartel like the Sinaloa cartel in Mexico. They controlled the eastern part of Mexico. And this really plunged the entire northern border of Mexico into violence because we had the Gulf Cartel fractioning and we had the Sinaloa cartel also fracturing, and then the Zetas, who really ignited this bloody battle for territory. And I was in the middle of that as a domestic reporter based in Austin, Texas, covering the U.S.-Mexico border. And all of us reporters found ourselves suddenly in this very sort of violent situation, having to have the kind of training that you would have maybe if you were covering a war zone, but it wasn't established as an actual war, but it was those kinds of casualties and that kind of violence. So we really had to learn how to deal with that and also how to figure out what was happening, because it was very confusing.
Melissa, did you start off covering crime or organized crime, or did you sort of move into it because it was such a dominant feature of the border area? I mean, how did you start reporting on these issues?
I didn't want to cover crime. I was covering the environment. I was covering health along the border and, trade, things like that. But when the violence really started in 2010 in real seriousness with the splintering of the Zetas, you could not avoid it because there were so many casualties, there were shootings going on, decapitations, and it just plunged border communities into a total turmoil and chaos. So you could not avoid it if you were covering the region.
The book's interesting because it's not only, well, it's about the cartels and violence for sure, but it's about the quarter horse industry, which of course I didn't know much about, and you describe very well. And it's about money laundering through the industry. Tell us something about that. And were you stumbling on bits of that? I mean, when did you recognize that there was a book, a bigger narrative that you could draw out?
Well, I used to have a quarter horse when I was a kid, so I've been one of those, I was one of those horse crazy kids. When the story broke, it was the New York Times actually that broke it, that the brother of Miguel and Omar Treviño, who were the leaders of Zetas, was laundering money through quarter horse racing in Texas. It was like, whoa, this is huge. This is a big deal. It's also very interesting because you're getting into the world of horse racing and horse breeding, also the drug cartel world, and also this regional world of Texas and Mexico, which I know really well. So it had all these different facets that were interesting to me.
I mean, did you immediately know that you could join these three or four themes, or it developed a bit as you wrote? I mean, did it develop as you thought it would develop?
All this time I was trying to figure out how to write about the violence that was happening. And, in the US, there was this very reactionary, thing called, they were like, spillover violence. This is going to spill over into the US, which really wasn't the case. I mean, a bit to some extent, but not really. Not the kinds of like shootings and horrible decapitations and things we were seeing in Mexico. So it was hard to write about that and hard for people to read, right? Because it is very grim. And I thought, this looking at the horse world of, horse trading, horse racing, and looking at the money laundering aspects of it is a way, I think, to write about this and to also put the context in there of the drug war and how it broke out and the kind of impact it's having on communities. So it seemed like a good vehicle, I think, to write about what I really wanted to write about, which was this violence that had completely thrown Mexico and, border communities on both sides of the border into just total chaos.
I want to turn to the violence now, but before we do, why was the quarter horse industry vulnerable to money laundering?
Yeah, that's a good question. So horse racing is a very status oriented sport. It's also very cash intensive. There's not a lot of paperwork, so you can have your assets. If you've got a lot of money and you're trying to launder it, it's a good vehicle for that because there's just not a lot of oversight, and the horses are worth a lot of money. They're worth even more money in the breeding industry than they are in the actual racing industry. It's also a very regional sport. It's very big in Mexico, Brazil, the southern part of the United States. So it's a unique culture within itself.
And it's a real industry. It's a sort of billions or millions of dollars and lots of people and interest. I mean, it's big. Give a sense to outsiders as to what size are we talking?
Yeah, I would say it's a multi-million dollar industry, and there are some major races where you can win, $1 million purse. So there are some big races and a lot of money on the line. And if you win these big races, your horse wins, then that horse is going to be worth even more money breeding that horse.
I mean, you describe in the book so well how the cartel figures, you've named some of them. The horse racing industry is also about prestige for them. It's of course laundering money, but it's winning races and putting yourself up the pecking order, so to speak. I mean, do you think that was also on the mind of these very, very, let's say, wealthy drug cartel leaders?
Yeah, I mean, the ways that they show their status, it's usually horses, cars, fighting roosters, For the Zetas, it was they really they grew up on ranches, and they really prided themselves on their horses, and they didn't try to hide it either, which was really wild. I mean, they were naming the horses like Break Out the Bullets, 44th, which was Miguel's call name in the Zetas was 40. Big Daddy Cartel was another another horse. So it wasn't, I mean,
It's
they
not
were,
hiding it really,
yeah,
no.
they weren't hiding it. They were really proud of their participation in the horses that they owned.
Do you think they had a sense of impunity there, Melissa? I mean, were they? I mean, you get the sense they are more careful on the U.S. side of the border. Clearly, they have a lot of impunity, as the book recounts, on the Mexican side of the border. But in naming their horses in those ways, as you explain, I mean, that suggests that they were pretty open about where they were from or what their connections were.
The trial in 2013 of José Treviño, who's the brother of Miguel and Omar, the one who was money laundering in Texas, was fascinating because they had so many witnesses. It was the first time we were able to look inside the Zetas and see how they operated, really as like a corporation. They were so dangerous. I mean, they'd killed reporters. It was very difficult. You couldn't just, of course, approach them and try to interview them, but suddenly we had this trial where we had Zeta founding members on the stand. We had accountants for them who had been deposed, who were testifying. So you could really see inside their operation and how it worked and how they really used terror and violence as their calling card and as an advantage to take over territory in Mexico.
So let's turn to the violence. And I have to say, it's difficult to write about, and it'd be interesting to get your view on that. We, as a research organization, are obviously looking at the violence by organized crime is deeply depressing, brutal, symbolic, as you write, sort of dismemberment of bodies, tremendous use of threat and violence. In your view, why the extreme level of violence, sort of off the charts cruelty? Is this simply about greed? Is that symbolic? Is it a way to drive fear? Is that people that have become sort of mentally unstable? I mean, what's your reading, reporting, and then writing on it now and in the book?
I mean, that was really my question. Why are they doing this? Why is it so violent? It was interesting to hear the testimonies during the trial and also the history of drug trafficking in Mexico, because for the longest time the dominant party there, the PRI party, would sell territory to the different cartels. That was the way they sort of managed the drug smuggling and the violence, and the way they also made money. So they sort of created this monster where, it would be like, okay, Sinaloa cartel, you take this territory, you're going to give us this amount of money in order to cross those drugs into the US. And there were these agreements and arrangements that were made through the dominant political party in Mexico. And when that split up, ironically, Mexico's democracy opened up and they got an opposition party in power, in Los Pinos. This sort of
Right.
broke up that old arrangement that the dominant political party had with the cartels. So everything splintered, and it got to the point where the cartels traded places with the politicians. They started controlling the politicians. They started controlling local elections, and they really went, city by city, taking over the political apparatus regionally and, city by city. So the Zetas did not have the advantage that Sinaloa or the Gulf Cartel had, which was, they had been making these arrangements for decades. They had their territory. The Zetas split off. They were brand new. So what they did is they used violence instead to conquer these areas. They scared these political operators who were, working with Sinaloa or Gulf, and they just took them over. And so they were kind of like this rapacious, violent sort of cancer that just took over parts of Mexico.
their background is sort of Mexican military special forces, so they, I guess, are attuned to violence. So violence is something they're familiar with, and they knew how to practice and target it. To what degree was that an element in this extraordinary brutality you write about?
Yeah, I mean, the founding members of the Zetas were special forces. Some of them were trained by the U.S., ironically, to fight drug trafficking. And they ended up becoming bodyguards for the leader of the Gulf Cartel because they could make a lot more money that way.
And they learned their trade basically there.
Yeah, they learned
Mm.
they learned all about the drug cartels and how they work. And at the same time, they had this military training. So they decided to splinter off, start their own cartel, and they use that military training and that taking over the territories very systematically through terror and sort of forcing people to into submission, basically.
I must say the violence is not overdone, but it's a very strong thread in the book, and you get the sense of how violent the Zetas were in these campaigns that Melissa describes. Melissa, you mentioned this other issue, which is this complete enmeshment in the politics. And there's this fascinating story of a businessman who's kidnapped, but he then, there's a political operative that appears and negotiates the way out. Melissa, you can feel free to provide more detail. But in the single incident, which you recount, it's very clear just how enmeshed things are. I mean, you've recounted how it became that way. I mean, how has that developed, post the book in your view?
Yeah, I mean, in the book, I get very much into how the money is laundered from Mexico into the US to buy these horses. And what the Zetas really needed is they needed legitimate business people and politicians who would launder the money for them and who had visas in the US and could travel back and forth. So they would co-opt these political leaders and business leaders either through violence or through, bribing them with money or both. They would be forced into it. And once you're in, it's like any mafia story. They can't get out because they know how the system works. They know who the point people are in the cartel. So they're really stuck in a very, very difficult situation.
So it's a very character-driven book, which is clearly one of its strengths. The key character is an FBI agent, and you clearly spoke a lot to several people to build the characters. I mean, tell us something about that. Did you need to exclude people? Was it difficult to get the main characters to trust you? Were people open? Did they know the extent to which they would be featuring in the book?
I covered the trial. I knew, okay, this is a fascinating story, and it could be a book, but it's all about getting access to the agents and to the people involved in the investigation. So, attending the trial every day, I was trying to sort of, get close to the agents, to Scott Lawson particularly, to see if he would be willing to let me write about him and the investigation. And luckily, I remember sort of cornering him in an elevator as he was trying to go downstairs from the courtroom and saying, "Hey, I'm a
It's a
reporter."
good journalistic technique,
Yeah,
Melissa,
yeah,
right?
cornering the FBI in an elevator. He couldn't escape
Yeah.
me. And I said, I've been covering the border a long time, and that helped too because I understood the context, of what was happening. They didn't have to catch me up, on who the Zetas were or what exactly was happening at that moment in Mexico. And he said, "Look, I can't talk to you right now. We're in the middle of a trial, but once the trial's over, I'd be willing to meet with you. Just get in touch with the media people at the FBI and see if you can set it up." So I did just that, and as an incentive for them to allow me to talk to their agents, I had to go to an FBI class for civilians. So I took some FBI courses, and then I did get to shoot some guns, like a Tommy gun and stuff like that.
And what was the purpose, Melissa? Just to get you some sense of the organization? I mean, and did they take, I mean, was there much persuading that you had to do? I mean, because the story is, of course, good for the FBI. I mean, it's a really interesting story, as you correctly identified, but it's a story that they don't mind showcasing. Were they eager that some parts were told and not others? I mean, how much control, if anything, was there?
In speaking to their public information officer, I told them what I wanted to do, that I'd already written a magazine story about the trial, and I wanted to do a full book sort of based on the trial. And the history of the Zetas and everything that had happened, and they said, yeah, that sounds good. And like you said, of course, it makes them look pretty good. I mean, they were pretty proud of what they had done. And I get into this bureaucracy in the book of how all these different federal agencies sort of vie for these big target investigations. So the FBI had a pretty brutal time pursuing this case because they were pitted against the DEA and HSI and all these other federal agencies. So they were proud of it. At the same time, there was no way that I was going to embroider things or do anything for them.
What's interesting about the book, just from, I suppose, technique, is it's character driven, and then and maybe this is your background as a journalist, because it's quite a complicated story: money and horses and an informant and Mexico, the US, and the Zetas themselves. But there's relatively short chapters, and they drive the story forward. I mean, you clearly thought that through. How easy was that to do, Melissa? I mean, did you start that way, or you went back and had to rework the text to give it that sort of onward momentum?
Well, it was really easy because I had the trial, so I just took it chronologically and I just followed the trial through and just followed things chronologically. So I had this structure to build the story on. And I think being a long form writer, what I'm always told by editors is that people don't want to get bogged down in characters. You got to keep it going, basically. And this is kind of a classic mafia book, right? There's a lot of different characters. And how do you keep those characters straight? How do you keep the story moving so that people move on to the next chapter? I guess I've been being told my entire career that nobody reads long stories anymore.
Yes, yes.
So as a long form writer and writing a book, I'm always like very mindful of moving things along and really trying to keep people engaged in the story.
Well, you certainly achieved that. I mean, I'm very interested, and I know people listening to this podcast are interested too. Did you exclude some characters, Melissa? I mean, people are coming in and out, and you've talked about the interagency competition, which is fascinating. The DEA guys appeared. I mean, did you go and interview them so you got a sense of who they were, or did you have enough to describe them, and you keep a sort of core group of characters moving forward?
Gosh, I think pretty much everybody's in there. And I did really make an effort to talk to everybody because I wanted to get every aspect of it. And I also didn't want the book to come out and have somebody come forward and be like, I was an important part of that investigation and you never spoke to me. So, it took a couple of years and I did make an effort. I traveled all around the country just meeting with the agents wherever they were. And it took a lot of difficulty, especially with the DEA, who was not happy with the FBI because it had initially been their case, they felt. So they were hard to get.
You also have this. Well, one of the key FBI agents, you use a different name to protect her identity, and you describe sort of the office politics. These two individuals sort of, I don't want to say fighting against the broader bureaucracy, but there's an element of that, and they get closer. Not quite a love story, but there's elements of affection. I mean, this was all part of the story.
Yeah, I mean, I thought it was fascinating. the contribution of women, especially in the FBI, I mean, Alma is absolutely crucial to the case and really helped Scott Lawson a lot because, for one, she spoke Spanish. She had family in Mexico. She understood the border, and Scott Lawson was just as fish out of the water coming from Tennessee, Southern guy, didn't speak any Spanish. I mean, she was absolutely crucial to the case. And, for a part of the case, she was pregnant, which is also amazing, being involved in such a complicated case with so much stress, and then being pregnant and going into these really dangerous situations. I just felt like her story was so important. But because she's from the border, I couldn't use her real name. So because she has to be very careful.
So one of the fascinating parts is the FBI essentially recruits an informant in the quarter racing industry. The farm basically dealing with the Zetas correctly, I mean indirectly, but I mean tell us something about that, because that's in terms of the investigation and the unfolding information that was available, that's a key part of the discussion, and this is very interesting part of the book.
So I was at the time living in Austin, Texas, and Tyler Graham, and their ranch was not far from where I lived in Austin. And Tyler's really the heir to this quarter horse dynasty. His grandfather is one of the owners of Heritage Place in Oklahoma City, which is like the preeminent auction house for quarter horses. They're very well known in the quarter horse industry. And I think unknowingly, Tyler got sort of trapped in this money laundering case. And this, of course, is also at the height of the great economic recession, in 2009, 2010, when things were really, really tough financially. And suddenly, this man, José Treviño, arrives with millions of dollars to spend. So it was very, I think, enticing,
Attractive
yeah,
proposition.
to many people in the
Yeah.
industry. And you really see too this conflict between, the originators of the quarter horse industry in the US dealing with the globalization of the industry, and also really suffering financially and having to make these concessions.
To turn to the issue of journalism, obviously you are working in the US. You dedicate the book to Mexican journalists, actually. I mean, do you have a sense of the damage that the cartel, wars, enforcement, corruption, violence has had on day-to-day journalism in Mexico?
Yeah, I mean, it's just been devastating. I basically spent probably 2010 to 2013 or 2014 just documenting the violence and documenting the murders of journalists, Mexican political leaders, cultural leaders, just this horrible devastation. And it gets very grim, and it gets very hard to follow, and because I followed it very closely. And you'll see in the book, the details of what the Zetas did to people. I spent like 2 years basically just documenting that, which was really terrible. And the bad part is that this violence hasn't ceased. We're now in 2026, and the drug war is still happening in different parts of Mexico. People are still being killed. The cartels are splintering, causing more volatility, more violence. So this problem hasn't gone away. I still get calls from, or I get emails from people saying, the cartels are buying horses here right now at the auction. You should do another story. So all of this is still continuing, unfortunately.
We ourselves are funding journalists in Mexico and civil society actors, and so the question is always asked, what's the point of doing that? Why is it important that these brutal killings, processes, illicit trade are covered? I mean, what's your take on that? Why do you think what you do is important?
Yeah, I mean, that's a very good question, right? Because it can feel really futile, especially as we see things getting worse here in the US as well. And the way I've sort of thought about it is that I'm recording this for posterity, at least. At the very minimum, I'm documenting what's actually happening so that people in the future can understand the nature of the conflict and why it happened. We're talking now about something that happened 2010, 2012, and that time it was so hard at that time to articulate exactly what was happening, who was profiting from the violence and why, and how much were elected officials involved. Through that case, I was able to sort of document, what was happening and why. So I think at the bare minimum, that's something that keeps me going. It's I've documented it, and so people in the future can understand, like, okay, how did things go off the rails so badly?
You use the word futile, referring to the sense that, day after day, is this making a difference? But there's an element of that also in the law enforcement characters in the book. They do this big case, but the very next day or the next week, trafficking continues, the ongoing engagement with the cartels continues, the violence continues. Yes, the case makes a dent, but it doesn't fundamentally solve the problem. Did you get some of this from interviewing people, the key characters you've mentioned, the sense of frustration that actually this is just forever and not immediately solvable in one law enforcement action?
Yeah, I have to say, in interviewing the agents, and spending so much time with Scott Lawson and Alma Perez and Steve Pennington from the IRS, I could very much identify similarities with my own job. I mean, they're cultivating informants within the cartel. They're having to establish trust with these people very, very quickly and for long periods of time. And that's a delicate balancing act with your informants because you're trying to also protect them. You don't want them to get killed while they're undercover and informing for you. In the work that I do, I am also approaching people within the cartel or within in different contexts and also trying to establish some trust so that they will speak to me and tell me what exactly is happening. And it's kind of an odd world. You're in this very gray area. You have your regular life, but then you also have this other life that's sort of hidden. And these are the sort, for me, my sources, and for them, they're informants.
And how do you keep those lives separate in your case, Melissa, or do they just sort of fuse together?
We really try to keep them separate, and it was very difficult during that time because I was, very affected by it. Keeping those things separate, it really takes a mental toll on you, and it can be very difficult for you and for your family. There are a lot of sacrifices that are made.
And is that because it starts to dominate your thought patterns, and this is all you think about, and you're waiting for informants to call, or you speak to them, and you have to go meet them, and of course you need to go meet them because these are crucial. You're sort of chasing parts of the story, I'm guessing. So, I mean, does that upend your life?
Yeah, I mean, you have to be available at any moment. If somebody wants to meet in, Memphis, Tennessee, or they want to meet in Laredo, you've got to be there. So you have to just leave at that moment. So yeah, it's like your mind is always somewhere else to a certain extent.
But they're highs, I assume. A great interview that fills in a piece of the story, and you walk away is wow. I mean, there were some of those, I assume.
Oh yeah, yeah, many, many times, it would be so hard to get, a federal agent or somebody that was involved with the cartel to talk and to finally get that would be amazing.
I understand.
Uh, yeah.
So tell us about the reaction to the book. I mean, uh, it's a sensitive subject. What did people say reading about it? Did you get sort of hostile comments, threats? Did you get sort of people who were puzzled about it or surprised by it? I mean, what was your own, maybe the best way of asking, what was your own sense of the reaction?
Well, Well, it was interesting. I think the quarter horse industry, I've gotten very positive feedback from them. I think, they said they were very happy that somebody wrote about this and exposed it, because it's an open secret within the industry. So they were glad to see it discussed, and they were glad that the agents were able to make some arrests.
Interesting. That's Melissa Del Bosque. Melissa, thank you very much. This was the book. It's a great read. It really, I think, exposes a very interesting part of the story, the money laundering angle. It's told in a way that keeps you reading. And it's an important story, Melissa, as you yourself say. Partly you've written it, I don't want to say for posterity, but to record a particular moment of history in the border area. So thank you for your work, and thank you for talking to us.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.